A flashing red and blue light in the rearview mirror should be a routine inconvenience, not a death sentence. Yet on a blistering July afternoon in the affluent suburbs of Oak Ridge, a simple traffic stop spiraled into a nightmare of unchecked authority and blatant prejudice. An arrogant patrolman thought he had found an easy target in a young defenseless teenager driving through the wrong neighborhood. He was dead wrong. Because this teenager had a fierce guardian angel, and that angel wore the golden trident of a United States Navy SEAL. The dashboard clock of the beat-up 2011 Honda Civic read 4:15 p.m. 19-year-old Trayton Miller wiped a bead of sweat from his forehead, adjusting the AC dial that had stopped blowing cold air 3 summers ago. The heat in Ohio was oppressive this time of year, radiating off the black asphalt in shimmering waves, but Trayton felt good. He had just finished his final exam for his summer biology course at the community college and was heading back to the house to celebrate. He drove carefully, his hands resting on the wheel at the 10 and 2 positions. He was navigating through the sprawling manicured streets of Oak Ridge, a wealthy, predominantly white enclave characterized by sweeping green lawns, wrought iron gates, and silent, judgmental neighborhood watch signs. Trayton didn't live here, but his guardian did. He was just 3 blocks away from the driveway when the agonizingly familiar chirp of a police siren shattered the afternoon quiet. Trayton's heart immediately dropped into his stomach. He checked his speedometer, 24 in a 25 zone. He checked his mirrors. Both headlights were working. His registration was up to date, and he was wearing his seatbelt. Despite knowing he had done absolutely nothing wrong, the primal spike of fear that shot through his veins was an instinct drilled into him by years of seeing what happened to young black men who made the wrong move during a traffic stop. He activated his right turn signal, slowly pulling the Civic over to the curb beneath the shade of a massive oak tree. He shifted into park, turned off the engine, and immediately rolled all 4 windows down. He placed his keys on the dashboard out of reach and rested both of his hands flat on the steering wheel where they were completely visible. He took a deep, shaky breath, trying to steady his racing pulse. In the driver's side mirror, he watched the patrol car door swing open. Out stepped Officer Garrett Reynolds. Reynolds was a veteran of the local force, a thickly built man in his late 40s with a buzz-cut mirrored aviator sunglasses and a swagger that suggested he owned the pavement he walked on. He didn't approach the car with the casual, cautious stride of a professional performing a routine stop. He walked with a predatory strut, his right hand resting casually yet deliberately on the butt of his sidearm. Trayton swallowed hard. Keep it respectful. Keep it brief. Get home, he repeated to himself. Afternoon, officer. Trayton said, his voice steady, despite the adrenaline coursing through his system. Reynolds didn't reply immediately. He leaned in close to the window, invading Trayton's personal space. The cop smelled of stale coffee and cheap peppermint gum. He slowly chewed his gum, his eyes hidden behind the dark lenses of his sunglasses, scanning the interior of the Civic as if looking for a murder weapon. He looked at Trayton's college backpack, the empty fast food wrappers on the passenger side, and finally back at Trayton's face. "You lost boy?" Reynolds finally asked. The word boy was dropped with a heavy, unmistakable weight. It wasn't a casual colloquialism. It was a deliberate choice of vocabulary meant to establish dominance and degrade. "No, sir," Trayton replied, keeping his eyes focused on the officer's badge rather than challenging his gaze. "I'm just heading home." Reynolds let out a sharp, humorless chuckle. "Home? Right. And where exactly is home? Because I know for a damn fact you don't live in Oak Ridge." "I live at 442 Sycamore Lane, sir, just a few blocks up." Reynolds' jaw tightened. Sycamore Lane was the most expensive street in the subdivision, home to doctors, lawyers, and business executives. "You expect me to believe a kid like you driving a piece of junk like this lives on Sycamore?" Reynolds sneered. "Let me see your license and registration, and move slow." "Yes, sir. My wallet is in my back right pocket, and the registration is in the glove compartment." Trayton narrated his movements exactly as he had been taught. He slowly retrieved his wallet, pulled out his ID, and leaned over to open the glove box. As he reached across, Reynolds abruptly unclipped his holster. I said, "Slow down, stop reaching." He barked, his voice suddenly echoing loudly through the quiet neighborhood. Trayton froze instantly, his hands shooting back up in the air. "My hands are up, sir. I'm not moving. You asked for my registration." "Shut your mouth," Reynolds hissed, leaning further into the window. "I tell you when to speak. You people always think you can just do whatever you want." Trayton bit the inside of his cheek, tasting a faint hint of copper. The injustice of the situation was burning in his chest, but he knew that arguing was the quickest way to end up in the back of a squad car, or worse. "My hands are on the wheel, officer. How would you like me to proceed?" Reynolds snatched the driver's license from Trayton's fingers, almost tearing it. He looked at the address. It did in fact list 442 Sycamore Lane, but rather than de-escalating this, seemed to make Reynolds even angrier. He didn't like being proven wrong, and he certainly didn't like his authority questioned, even silently, by a kid he had already judged and convicted in his mind. "Step out of the vehicle," Reynolds commanded, stepping back and opening the driver's side door himself. "Sir, respectfully, why did you pull me over?" Trayton asked, keeping his hands raised. "I wasn't speeding, and my tags are good." "I said step out of the damn car," Reynolds roared, reaching in and grabbing Trayton by the shoulder of his t-shirt. With a rough, violent yank, he pulled the teenager out of the driver's seat. Trayton stumbled, barely catching his balance before Reynolds shoved him hard against the side of the Civic. "Hands behind your back." Reynolds ordered, kicking Trayton's feet apart to spread eagle him against the hot metal of the car. "I didn't do anything wrong." Trayton pleaded, the humiliation starting to well up in his throat. Neighbors were beginning to peek through their curtains. A woman walking her golden retriever on the opposite sidewalk stopped and stared, her eyes wide with judgment. To the outside world, Trayton looked like a dangerous criminal being apprehended, not an innocent college student trying to get home. "Shut up," Reynolds spat, patting Trayton down with unnecessary force. He ran his hands roughly over the teenager's pockets, his ribs, his legs. Finding no weapons, he unclipped a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his belt. Click, click. The cold metal bit into Trayton's wrists as they were wrenched behind his back. "You're being detained," Reynolds declared, turning Trayton around and pushing him toward the curb. "Sit your ass down on the grass and don't move." Trayton awkwardly lowered himself to the ground, the hot afternoon sun beating down on his neck. His shoulders ached from the unnatural angle of the cuffs. He looked up at Reynolds, his voice trembling but defiant. "You have no right to do this. I know my rights. You don't have probable cause." Reynolds laughed, a cruel, grating sound. He adjusted his sunglasses and looked down at Trayton as if he were an insect. "Probable cause. Let me tell you how this works in the real world, kid. You're driving a suspicious vehicle in a high-theft neighborhood. You match the description of a suspect in a recent string of burglaries. That gives me all the cause I need to tear this car apart, and I guarantee you I'm going to find whatever it is you're hiding." With that, Reynolds turned his back on the helpless teenager and began to ransack the Honda Civic. Sitting on the curb with his hands bound behind him, Trayton could only watch in agonizing silence as Officer Reynolds tore his life apart. The cop started with the passenger seat, dumping Trayton's college backpack upside down onto the floorboards. Textbooks, a graphing calculator, pens, and heavily highlighted biology notes spilled out, scattering across the dirty floor mats. Reynolds kicked them aside dismissively. He tore through the center console, tossing out old receipts, charging cables, and a pair of cheap sunglasses. The humiliation was a physical weight pressing down on Trayton's chest. A few houses down, a man came out to water his lawn, stopping to openly stare at the spectacle. The unspoken narrative was clear: the police had caught a thug. Trayton felt tears of frustration pricking the corners of his eyes, but he refused to let them fall. He would not give this arrogant bully the satisfaction of seeing him break. Reynolds popped the trunk lever. The trunk swung open with a rusty squeak. Trayton's stomach tightened. There were no drugs or weapons in the trunk, but there was something incredibly valuable, something deeply personal that he knew Reynolds would use against him. Reynolds leaned into the trunk and emerged a moment later, dragging a heavy olive-drab military duffel bag. The bag was made of thick canvas, reinforced with tactical webbing, and bore faded black stencil lettering that read, "Right T." The cop dropped the heavy bag onto the pavement with a loud thud. He unzipped the main compartment and began pulling items out, laying them on the trunk of the Civic. First came a folded tactical vest, then a pair of worn desert combat boots. Next was a small velvet-lined wooden box. Reynolds opened the box, revealing a collection of heavy brass military challenge coins and a gleaming Silver Star medal resting on a bed of blue satin. Finally, he pulled out a meticulously folded American flag, the kind given to families of fallen soldiers encased in a clear plastic protective sleeve. Reynolds stared at the items for a long moment. A slow, triumphant smile spread across his face. He turned back to Trayton, his mirrored glasses reflecting the teenager on the ground. "Well, well, well," Reynolds said, his voice dripping with venomous satisfaction. "What do we have here? A regular one-man army?" "That's not mine," Trayton said quickly, trying to maintain his composure. "It belongs to my guardian. He left it in my car yesterday after I picked him up from the airport." "Your guardian," Reynolds repeated mockingly. He picked up the velvet box holding the Silver Star. "You expect me to believe that a punk kid like you has a guardian who earned a Silver Star? Let me guess he's a secret agent too." "His name is Commander Thomas Wright," Trayton said, his voice rising in desperation. "He's a Navy SEAL. He just returned from a deployment. Please just look at the name on the bag. It says Wright. That's his gear." Reynolds scoffed, tossing the velvet box back onto the trunk with a careless clatter that made Trayton wince. "You're a terrible liar, kid. Guys like you see a car unlocked at a gas station, you grab whatever you can. You probably stole this out of some veteran's garage thinking you could pawn the medals." "I didn't steal anything," Trayton yelled, finally losing his iron grip on his temper. "I told you it's his. Call him. His number is in my phone. Just call him and he'll tell you." Reynolds walked over to the curb and stood directly over Trayton, casting a long dark shadow over the teenager. "You don't give me orders. You understand I know exactly what I'm looking at. I'm looking at a thief who got caught red-handed with stolen government property. That's a federal offense, boy. You're not just going to the county jail. You're looking at real time. 10 years in a federal penitentiary." Trayton felt the blood drain from his face. He knew Reynolds was lying. Knew the cop was trying to terrify him, but the sheer power imbalance was terrifying. Reynolds had the badge. Reynolds had the gun. If Reynolds wrote in his report that Trayton had confessed to stealing the bag, who would the judge believe, an affluent veteran police officer with a spotless record of arrests, or a young black teenager from the inner city who had only moved to Oak Ridge 2 years ago? "Please," Trayton whispered, the fight temporarily leaving him. "Just check my phone. It's on the dashboard. Call Thomas. He'll clear this all up." Reynolds smirked. "Oh, I'll make a call. I'm going to call for a tow truck to impound this piece of garbage car. Then I'm going to call my precinct and tell them to prep a holding cell." Reynolds turned back to the Civic to grab his radio mic. He reached into the driver's side window. Just as his hand grasped the radio, a sudden sharp buzzing sound interrupted the quiet street. It was Trayton's cell phone resting exactly where he had left it on the dashboard. The screen was illuminated, vibrating violently against the hard plastic. Reynolds paused. He looked down at the phone. In large bold letters across the cracked screen, the caller ID read, "Commander Thomas." A cruel idea formed in Reynolds' mind. He loved breaking the spirit of the people he arrested. He loved showing them that nobody could save them, that he was the ultimate authority. He reached out and picked up the ringing phone. "Don't answer that," Trayton pleaded from the curb, straining against his handcuffs. "That's him. You're making a mistake." "I think I will answer it," Reynolds said, his grin widening. "I think I'll let your little friend know that you're going away for a long, long time." Reynolds swiped the green icon on the screen and brought the phone to his ear. "Trey, where are you, son? You said you'd be home 10 minutes ago. The grill is hot." The voice on the other end of the line was deep, resonant, and calm. It didn't sound like an angry parent or a confused friend. It sounded like a man who was used to giving orders and having them followed without question. Reynolds leaned against the door of the Civic, crossing his ankles in a display of utter nonchalance. Well, Trey isn't going to be making it to any barbecues today, or anytime soon for that matter. There was a pause on the line, a heavy, absolute silence. When the voice spoke again, the casual warmth was completely gone, replaced by a chilling, icy precision. "Who is this?" the voice demanded. "This is Officer Garrett Reynolds with the Oak Ridge Police Department." Reynolds puffed his chest out, speaking loudly, so Trayton could hear every word. "I've got your boy here in handcuffs. Caught him with a trunk full of stolen military gear. So, unless you want to be charged as an accessory, I suggest you lose this number." Another pause. Longer this time. The silence on the other end of the phone was heavy, almost suffocating. It wasn't the silence of fear. It was the silence of a predator calculating the exact distance to its prey. "Officer Reynolds," the voice said softly. It was so quiet Reynolds had to press the phone tighter to his ear. "Look closely at the gear you claim he stole. Look at the name stenciled on the bag." Reynolds rolled his eyes. "Yeah, I see it. Right T. What's your point?" "My point," the voice said, dropping an octave into a tone of pure, unadulterated menace, "is that my name is Commander Thomas Wright of the United States Navy Naval Special Warfare Development Group. That is my gear. That is my ward sitting on the curb. And if you have harmed one single hair on his head, your badge will be the least of the things I strip from you today." Reynolds burst out laughing. It was a loud, obnoxious sound that echoed down the street. "Oh, that's rich. A Navy SEAL. Listen, pal, I don't care if you claim to be the ghost of George Washington. This kid is a thief, and if you show your face here, I'll lock you up right next to him for impersonating an officer." "I am 3 blocks away," Commander Wright said. The absolute lack of emotion in his voice was far more terrifying than if he had been screaming. "Do not move. Do not speak to him. Do not touch him again." The line went dead with a sharp click. Officer Reynolds lowered the phone, staring at the black screen for a moment before bursting into a fresh fit of laughter. He tossed the phone carelessly onto the passenger seat of the Civic and turned his attention back to the teenager sitting on the curb. "You and your friends are quite the actors," Reynolds mocked, walking over and standing above Trayton. "Commander Wright, oh, I'm shaking in my boots. What's he going to do, rappel out of a helicopter and rescue you? You people watch too many movies." Trayton didn't say a word. He just stared up at the cop, his dark eyes wide, not with fear anymore, but with a sudden profound sense of anticipation. Trayton knew Thomas Wright. He knew the man who had served 3 tours in Afghanistan, the man who had held his dying brother in his arms during a firefight in Fallujah, the man who had legally adopted Trayton to keep him out of the foster system. Thomas Wright was not a man who made empty threats. "Get up!" Reynolds barked, reaching down and grabbing Trayton by the collar of his shirt again. He hauled the teenager to his feet, ignoring Trayton's wince of pain as the handcuffs dug deeper into his wrists. "Playtime is over. We're going to the station." Reynolds began marching Trayton toward the back of the police cruiser, intending to shove him into the suffocating heat of the back seat. He never made it. The roar of a massive engine shattered the suburban tranquility. It wasn't the polite hum of a luxury sedan or the rattling exhaust of a teenager's sports car. It was the deep, guttural, earth-shaking growl of a heavy-duty, customized Ford F250 Super Duty truck. It came tearing around the corner of Sycamore Lane, tires shrieking against the asphalt as it took the turn at a speed that defied physics. The truck was matte black, devoid of chrome, sitting on massive, all-terrain tires. It looked less like a civilian vehicle and more like an urban assault transport. Reynolds froze his hand, still gripping Trayton's collar. He watched in stunned disbelief as the monstrous truck barreled down the street, aimed directly at his police cruiser. For a split second, Reynolds thought the maniac driving was going to ram him. Instead, the truck slammed on its brakes, the anti-lock system screaming as the heavy vehicle skidded sideways. It came to a violently abrupt halt, boxing the police cruiser in against the curb with mere inches to spare. The aggressive maneuver was executed with such terrifying precision that Reynolds instinctively reached for his sidearm. Before the dust had even settled, the driver's side door of the truck flew open. The man who stepped out did not look like a suburban dad coming to pick up a teenager. He looked like violence incarnate, tightly leashed and wrapped in an aura of absolute crushing authority. Commander Thomas Wright was a towering figure standing 6'3", with shoulders broad enough to block out the sun. He was dressed in off-duty tactical attire, dark khaki cargo pants, rugged combat boots, and a tight black t-shirt that barely concealed the thick muscular cords of his arms. Intricate tribal tattoos intertwined with military insignia snaked down his right forearm, disappearing beneath the sleeve. His face was chiseled from granite, deeply tanned and marred by a faded, jagged scar that ran from his left cheekbone down to his jawline, a permanent souvenir from a piece of shrapnel in Kandahar. But it was his eyes that stopped Reynolds dead in his tracks. They were a piercing, icy grey, devoid of any warmth or mercy. They locked onto Reynolds like a laser targeting system. For the first time in his 20-year career, Officer Garrett Reynolds felt a cold spike of genuine paralyzing fear shoot down his spine. The bravado, the arrogance, the smug superiority, it all evaporated in an instant, burned away by the sheer magnitude of the predator standing before him. Commander Wright didn't run. He didn't shout. He walked toward the officer with a slow, deliberate, measured stride that promised absolute devastation if he was crossed. Every step was calculated. Every movement screamed lethal proficiency. He bypassed his own truck, ignored the scattered contents of Trayton's car, and walked directly up to Reynolds. He stopped exactly 2 feet away, invading the officer's personal space, just as Reynolds had done to Trayton earlier. But where Reynolds had used cheap intimidation, Wright radiated a quiet, overwhelming dominance. "Take your hand off my son," Wright commanded. His voice was not loud, but it carried a sub-harmonic vibration that seemed to rattle the pavement. Reynolds blinked, his mouth suddenly dry. He realized his hand was still clutching Trayton's shirt. His brain screamed at him to assert his authority, to demand identification, to pull his gun. But his instincts, the primal animal part of his brain, screamed at him to submit before he was torn apart. Slowly, almost involuntarily, Reynolds uncurled his fingers. He let go of Trayton's shirt and took a half-step backward. Wright didn't even look at the cop as he shifted his focus. His cold eyes softened fractionally as he looked at the teenager. "Trey, are you hurt?" "No, sir," Trayton replied, his voice shaking slightly. He stood taller now that Thomas was here. "Just my wrists." Wright's eyes snapped down to the heavy steel handcuffs binding Trayton's hands behind his back. The muscles in his jaw flexed a dangerous pulsing rhythm. He slowly turned his gaze back to Reynolds. "Take the cuffs off," Wright said. It was not a request. Reynolds swallowed hard, trying to summon whatever shreds of his ego remained. He puffed his chest out, resting his hand on his duty belt, trying to regain control of the situation. Neighbors were watching from their porches now. He couldn't back down. "Now hold on a minute, buddy." Reynolds stammered, his voice lacking its previous venom. "I don't know who you think you are, but you can't just come out here and interfere with a police investigation. This suspect is under arrest for possession of stolen property. That gear on the trunk." "That gear," Wright interrupted, taking one slow half-step forward, closing the distance until he was towering over the cop, "was issued to me by the United States Department of Defense. The silver star on that trunk was pinned on my chest by the President of the United States. The flag next to it draped the coffin of my sniper Trayton's older brother before I brought him home from a war zone you couldn't survive for 5 minutes in." Reynolds opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. The blood rushed to his face as the reality of his colossal mistake began to set in. You didn't run his plates. You didn't check his ID against the registration. Wright continued, his voice dropping into a deadly quiet hiss. "You saw a young black man driving a cheap car in an expensive neighborhood, and your tiny prejudiced brain decided he must be a criminal. You illegally searched his vehicle, you assaulted him, and you humiliated him." I had probable cause." Reynolds lied weakly, his eyes darting around, looking for an escape. "He looked suspicious. Take the cuffs off." Wright repeated, leaning down so his face was inches from Reynolds' nose. "Before I show you exactly what suspicious looks like." Reynolds' hands were shaking as he reached for the keys on his belt. The power dynamic had not just shifted, it had been completely obliterated. He fumbled with the small silver key, stepping behind Trayton and unlocking the cuffs. The steel ratchets clicked open, and Trayton immediately brought his arms forward, rubbing the deep red indentations on his wrists. "Go sit in the truck, Trey," Wright said softly, his eyes never leaving the police officer. "Yes, sir," Trayton said, walking quickly past the stunned cop and climbing into the passenger seat of the massive F250. Once the door clicked shut, Wright turned his full, terrifying attention back to Reynolds. The cop tried to take another step back, but he bumped into the side of his own cruiser. He was trapped. "I have your badge number, Officer Reynolds," Wright said, his voice as cold as absolute zero. "I have the dashcam footage from my truck which just recorded you holding a compliant citizen by the throat. And in about 30 seconds, I'm going to make a phone call to a very good friend of mine." Reynolds tried to swallow, but his throat was completely dry. "Who?" he managed to whisper. A terrifying, humorless smile touched the corners of Wright's mouth. "The Chief of Police for Oak Ridge County, a man I served with in Ramadi, a man who owes me his life. Let's see what he thinks about your probable cause." Officer Garrett Reynolds watched paralyzed as Commander Thomas Wright slowly reached into his cargo pocket and retrieved a sleek black smartphone. Every instinct Reynolds had honed over 20 years of bullying civilians screamed at him to act, to escalate, to take back control of the street. He reached down and unclipped his radio microphone, his thumb trembling over the transmit button. "Unit 4 to dispatch." Reynolds stammered, his voice cracking with a high-pitched edge of panic that he couldn't disguise. "I have a 1032 situation on Sycamore Lane. Hostile suspect interfering with an arrest. I need backup. Now. Code 3. Wright didn't even blink. He dialed a number from his contacts and brought the phone to his ear, his icy grey eyes never leaving the sweat-drenched face of the patrolman. "Dave." Wright said, his voice dropping into a casual but deadly serious register. "It's Tommy. I'm on Sycamore Lane. I need you down here immediately. One of your patrolmen just illegally detained, assaulted, and threatened my kid." A beat of silence passed as Wright listened to the voice on the other end. "Officer Garrett Reynolds." Wright stated, reading the silver nameplate pinned to the cop's chest. "Yes, he's still here. I'd advise you to get here before his backup does. I am holding the perimeter." Wright hung up the phone and slipped it back into his pocket. He crossed his massive arms over his chest, standing like a stone sentinel between the police cruiser and his own truck, where Trayton was watching with wide eyes. "You're making a huge mistake, buddy." Reynolds tried to sneer, though his legs felt like jelly. "When my boys get here, they aren't going to care about your medals. You're going to be eating asphalt right next to that little punk." "Your boys are going to do exactly what they are trained to do," Wright replied evenly. "And then your chief is going to arrive, Chief David Harrington, a man who owes me his life from a night in Ramadi when his convoy was ambushed and my team had to pull him out of a burning Humvee. We'll see whose side he takes." Reynolds felt the bottom drop out of his stomach. Chief Harrington was a hardline, no-nonsense leader who had recently taken over the Oak Ridge precinct to clean up corruption. He was a former Marine, fiercely loyal to military veterans and notoriously unforgiving of officers who abused their badges. If this giant of a man truly knew Harrington, if he was telling the truth about Ramadi, Reynolds was not just looking at a reprimand. He was looking at the end of his career. The wail of approaching sirens pierced the heavy suburban air. 2 Oak Ridge Police Department cruisers came tearing around the corner from opposite ends of Sycamore Lane, their light bars strobing aggressively in the afternoon sun. They screeched to a halt, boxing in Wright's truck and Reynolds' cruiser. 4 officers sprang from the vehicles, their hands resting on their unholstered weapons. They fanned out quickly, assessing the bizarre scene, their veteran colleague looking pale and terrified, leaning against his cruiser, and a massive, heavily tattooed man standing completely still, entirely unbothered by the sudden influx of armed police. "Reynolds, what's the situation?" shouted Officer Jenkins, a younger cop with his weapon drawn and pointed at the pavement. "Arrest him!" Reynolds screamed, pointing a trembling finger at Wright. He's interfering with a felony stop. The kid in the truck is a suspect in the neighborhood burglaries, and this guy is trying to help him escape. Jenkins raised his weapon slightly, pointing it in Wright's general direction. Sir, keep your hands where I can see them. Step away from the vehicle. Wright did not raise his hands. He did not move. He simply turned his head and locked his piercing grey eyes on Jenkins. Officer Jenkins, my name is Commander Thomas Wright, United States Navy. My hands are completely visible. I am unarmed. I am not a threat to you. But if you point that weapon at me again, I will consider it an act of aggression. Your chief is 3 minutes away. I suggest you lower your firearm and wait for his command. The absolute authority in Wright's voice acted like a physical blow. Jenkins hesitated. He looked at the heavy military duffel bag spilled across the trunk of the Honda Civic. He saw the gleaming silver star. He saw the folded flag. Then he looked at Reynolds, who was sweating profusely and refused to make eye contact with his fellow officers. Jenkins slowly lowered his weapon, clicking the safety back on. Hold your fire, he muttered to the other officers. Let's just secure the scene. What are you doing? Reynolds shrieked. I gave you a lawful order! Arrest him! Before Jenkins could respond, the deep, authoritative roar of an unmarked black Chevy Tahoe shattered the standoff. The SUV blew through the neighborhood intersection, its hidden grille lights flashing crimson and blue. It slammed on the brakes, stopping diagonally across the lawns to block the entire street. The driver's door swung open, and Chief David Harrington stepped out. He was a stocky, silver-haired man, with a bulldog jaw and a demeanor that commanded instant respect. He didn't bother looking at the junior officers. He marched straight through the perimeter, his eyes locked on the towering figure of the Navy SEAL. Tommy, Chief Harrington said, stopping a few feet away. The tension in the chief's shoulders relaxed fractionally. Dave. Wright nodded. To the absolute horror of Officer Reynolds, Chief Harrington stepped forward and wrapped the massive SEAL in a brief, hard embrace. It's good to see you alive, brother. I wish it was under better circumstances. Harrington pulled back and turned his head. The warmth in his eyes vanished, replaced by a storm of fury as he locked sights on Reynolds. Garrett, the chief growled, his voice dangerously low. You have exactly 1 minute to explain to me why Commander Wright's son was sitting on a curb in handcuffs. Reynolds swallowed his Adam's apple, bobbing nervously. He stood up straight, trying to project a confidence he no longer possessed. He had to spin this. He had to rely on his years of experience manipulating the narrative to survive. Chief, with all due respect, I was conducting a lawful traffic stop. Reynolds began, his voice taking on the polished, practiced tone of a courtroom testimony. The suspect's vehicle matched the profile of the suspects involved in the recent string of high-end burglaries in this subdivision. When I pulled him over, the driver was belligerent. He made furtive movements toward the glove box. For my own safety, I detained him and conducted a probable cause search of the vehicle. Harrington crossed his arms. And what exactly did this probable cause search yield Garrett aside from desecrating a war hero's military decorations? The chief gestured in disgust toward the medals scattered on the trunk. Reynolds puffed out his chest, reaching into his left cargo pocket. It yielded this, Chief. With a dramatic flourish, Reynolds produced a heavy, gleaming gold watch. It was a stunning piece of jewelry encrusted with small diamonds around the bezel. He held it up by the band so the sunlight caught the precious metal. I found this stuffed under the passenger seat. Reynolds lied smoothly, a confident smirk returning to his face. A solid gold Rolex Daytona. Now you tell me, Chief, does a 19-year-old kid driving a beat-up Honda Civic legally own a $40,000 timepiece I was about to run the serial number when this gentleman arrived and began threatening me? A heavy silence fell over the street. The junior officers exchanged nervous glances. If Reynolds had found stolen jewelry in the car, it changed the entire dynamic of the stop. It provided the justification Reynolds desperately needed to save his badge. Inside the F-25. Oh! Trayton rolled down the window. That's a lie! The teenager yelled, his voice cracking with outrage. I have never seen that watch in my life. He didn't pull that out of my car. He pulled it out of his own pocket. Shut your mouth, kid, before I add perjury to your charges, Reynolds snapped back. He turned to the chief playing the victim. You see what I'm dealing with here, sir? These people, they lie as easily as they breathe. Chief Harrington stared at the gold watch dangling from Reynolds's fingers. He reached out and plucked it from the officer's hand. Harrington inspected the heavy timepiece, tracing his thumb over the diamond bezel, reading the serial number engraved on the back of the casing. As Harrington examined the watch, Commander Wright took a slow step forward. His sharp eyes scanned the front of Reynolds' uniform, then drifted to the dashboard of the patrol cruiser behind them. Officer Reynolds, Wright said quietly. Is your body camera operational? Reynolds scoffed. Of course it is, but it malfunctioned right as I pulled the kid over. Blinking red light. These cheap pieces of city equipment never work when you need them. How convenient, Wright noted, his voice laced with venom. And your dashcam? Angle was wrong, Reynolds fired back quickly. Pointed at the license plate. It didn't catch the interior search. Wright looked at Chief Harrington. The two veterans shared a microscopic nod, a silent communication forged in the fires of combat. They both knew a liar when they saw one. But Harrington didn't just know Reynolds was lying. He knew something much, much worse. Chief Harrington slowly lowered the gold watch, his face turning an alarming shade of crimson. The veins in his thick neck bulged against his collar. Garrett, Harrington whispered. It was a terrifying sound. Do you know who owns this watch? Reynolds hesitated, his smirk faltering. I assume one of the homeowners from the recent burglaries on Elm Street, sir. Like I said, it's stolen property. It is stolen property. Harrington agreed, taking a step toward Reynolds. It belongs to Marcus Vanderbilt, the CEO, who lives 3 blocks from here. It was reported stolen from his master bedroom safe 2 nights ago. Exactly. Chief, I cracked the case. This kid is the fence. Shut up! Harrington roared, the sudden explosion of volume making Jenkins and the other officers flinch. It was reported stolen 2 nights ago. Do you know who the responding officer was on that call, Garrett? Do you remember who secured the crime scene before the detectives arrived? The colour instantly drained from Reynolds's face, leaving him a ghastly, sickly white. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. It was you! Harrington snarled, stepping into Reynolds's space, bringing his face inches from the corrupt cop. You took the initial report. You were alone in the master bedroom for 20 minutes before backup arrived. Reynolds began to visibly shake. Chief, no, you're mistaken. The detectives had been wondering how the burglars knew the exact codes to the security gates. Harrington continued, his voice echoing loudly for all the neighbors to hear. They've been wondering why patrols were always mysteriously reassigned to the other side of town right before a house was hit. We suspected we had a leak, a rat in the department, but I never imagined you were stupid enough to be the bagman. The twist hit the street like a shockwave. Officer Garrett Reynolds wasn't just a racist bully looking to harass a black teenager. He was the inside man for the very burglary ring he was using as an excuse to terrorize the neighborhood. He had kept the gold Rolex for himself, a little extra off the top. When Commander Wright had cornered him, Reynolds had panicked, in a desperate bid to manufacture probable cause and save his own skin. He had reached into his pocket and produced the only piece of contraband. He had his own stolen loot, intending to plant it on Trayton. He had just handed the chief of police the physical evidence of his own felony. The absolute silence that followed Harrington's revelation was deafening. The only sound was the low, steady idle of Wright's massive Ford truck. Reynolds looked frantically from Harrington to Wright, and then to the junior officers who were now staring at him with a mixture of shock and utter disgust. The walls were rapidly closing in. His 20-year career, his pension, his freedom, all of it was evaporating in the sweltering July heat. Chief, please. Reynolds begged, his voice dropping into a pathetic, trembling whisper. It's not what it looks like. I confiscated that watch from a pawn shop informant. I was bringing it into evidence today. I just got confused in the heat of the moment. You planted evidence on an innocent kid to cover up your own corruption. Harrington stated, his voice devoid of any pity. You used the authority of that badge to terrorize a boy who was just trying to drive home, all because you needed a scapegoat for your own crimes. You are a disgrace to this uniform. Desperation is a dangerous catalyst. In a split second of panicked animalistic logic, Reynolds decided he wasn't going to spend the rest of his life in a federal penitentiary. His right hand twitched, dropping toward the grip of his standard-issue Glock 19 resting in its holster on his hip. He never even cleared the leather. Before Reynolds' fingers could fully wrap around the pistol grip, Commander Thomas Wright moved. It was not the clumsy telegraphing movement of a bar brawler. It was the blindingly fast, ruthlessly efficient kinetic strike of a Tier 1 operator. Wright closed the 2-foot gap in a microsecond. His left hand shot out, clamping down on Reynolds' wrist with the crushing force of a steel vice, pinning the cop's hand to his weapon and trapping it in the holster. Simultaneously, Wright's right forearm swept up in a brutal upward arc, catching Reynolds squarely under the chin. The impact snapped Reynolds' head back with a sickening crack. Before the corrupt cop could even process the pain, Wright pivoted on his heel, using Reynolds' own momentum against him. With a violent twist of his hips, Wright executed a flawless judo sweep, sweeping Reynolds' legs entirely out from under him. Reynolds was airborne for a fraction of a second before he slammed face first onto the blistering hot hood of his own police cruiser. The heavy metal dented under his weight. Wright immediately drove his knee into the small of Reynolds' back, pinning him immovably against the hood. Wright yanked Reynolds' right arm up behind his back, twisting it to the absolute breaking point. "Don't move," Wright whispered, directly into Reynolds' ear, his voice a chilling monotone. "Breathe wrong, and I will snap your humerus in half." Reynolds groaned in agony, his cheek pressed against the burning metal, completely incapacitated. The junior officers instinctively reached for their weapons at the sudden violence, but Chief Harrington threw his hand up. "Stand down. Nobody moves," Harrington commanded. Harrington walked slowly over to the hood of the cruiser. He looked down at his corrupt officer, his face set in stone. "Officer Jenkins," Harrington barked, without looking away from Reynolds. "Relieve this man of his weapon. Then you will retrieve his handcuffs. The very same handcuffs he unlawfully used on that young man." Jenkins stepped forward quickly. His hands were shaking slightly as he unsnapped Reynolds' holster and removed the loaded Glock, handing it carefully to the chief. Jenkins then unclipped the steel cuffs from Reynolds' belt. Wright eased the pressure on Reynolds' arm just enough for Jenkins to snap the cold steel rings around the corrupt cop's wrists. Click. Click. The sound was poetic justice echoing down the street. Once Reynolds was securely bound, Wright stepped back, smoothing out the front of his black t-shirt, as if he had just finished a mild workout. He didn't even look at Reynolds as Jenkins hauled the groaning man off the hood of the car. Harrington stepped directly in front of Reynolds. With a swift, forceful yank, the chief ripped the silver Oak Ridge PD badge off Reynolds' chest, taking a piece of the uniform shirt with it. "Garrett Reynolds, you are under arrest for grand larceny, corruption, under color of law assault and tampering with evidence," Harrington recited, holding the badge up in front of Reynolds' face. "You make me sick. Put him in the back of his own cruiser. Roll the windows up. Let him sweat until the transport van gets here." Jenkins and Miller dragged the humiliated, broken cop toward the rear door of the cruiser. Reynolds didn't struggle. He didn't speak. He just stared at the ground, a defeated, broken man who had finally preyed upon the wrong target. With the immediate threat neutralized, the heavy tension in the air finally began to dissipate. Harrington let out a long, exhausted sigh, pinching the bridge of his nose. He turned to Commander Wright. "Tommy, I don't even know what to say. If you hadn't shown up, that piece of garbage would have ruined that kid's life." "He tried, Dave," Wright said quietly, turning his gaze toward his truck. "He tried." Wright walked slowly over to the F250 and opened the passenger door. Trayton was sitting inside the air conditioning blasting, but the teenager was shivering. The sheer adrenaline of the last 30 minutes was finally wearing off, leaving behind a cold, hollow wave of delayed shock. "Come here, son," Wright said gently, his deep voice entirely stripped of its former lethal edge. Trayton unbuckled his seatbelt and practically fell out of the truck, throwing his arms around the massive seal. Wright wrapped his thick arms around the boy, pulling him into a tight, fiercely protective embrace. He rested his chin on the top of Trayton's head, closing his eyes. "I've got you, Trey." Wright whispered, his hand gently patting the back of the teenager's neck. "You did everything right. You kept your cool, you remembered what I taught you, and you survived. I'm so damn proud of you." Trayton buried his face in Wright's chest, a single ragged sob escaping his throat. "He was going to lock me away, Thomas. He was going to frame me. If you hadn't answered the phone—" "I will always answer, Trey," Wright said, his voice thick with emotion. "I promised your brother I would look after you, and I meant it. No one in this world is ever going to touch you while I'm breathing. You understand me?" Trayton nodded against his chest. Chief Harrington walked over quietly, holding his hat in his hands. He stopped a respectful distance away, waiting until Wright pulled back and looked at him. "Trayton," Harrington said softly, "on behalf of the Oak Ridge Police Department and the city, I am profoundly sorry for what you endured today. That badge is supposed to be a shield for the innocent, not a weapon for bullies. We are going to make this right. I promise you that." Trayton looked at the chief, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. "Thank you, sir. Dave," Wright said, turning to look at his old friend. "I need to get him home. We'll come down to the precinct tomorrow to give our official statements." "Take all the time you need, Tommy." Harrington nodded. "Reynolds isn't going anywhere. He'll be in federal lockup by midnight. I'll have a crew come and tow Trayton's car to your house free of charge. Just get him home." Wright nodded his thanks. He walked over to the trunk of the Honda Civic. With meticulous, reverent care, he repacked his deployment gear. He folded his tactical vest, placed his challenge coins back in their velvet box, and gently laid his silver star on top. Finally, he picked up the folded American flag. He brushed a speck of dust off the protective plastic sleeve, holding it tightly for a moment, before placing it securely in the canvas bag. He zipped the bag shut, threw it over his massive shoulder, and walked back to the truck. He climbed into the driver's seat, started the roaring engine, and put it in gear. As they drove slowly down Sycamore Lane, leaving the flashing police lights and the ruined career of Garrett Reynolds in their rearview mirror, Wright reached across the console and placed his large, calloused hand on Trayton's shoulder, giving it a reassuring squeeze. Trayton looked out the window at the manicured lawns and sweeping oak trees. The neighborhood looked exactly the same as it had an hour ago, but the world felt entirely different. He knew the ugly reality of prejudice was still out there, lurking behind badges and gated communities. But as he looked at the hardened, scarred profile of the Navy SEAL sitting next to him, Trayton knew something else too. He knew he would never have to face it alone. 6 months later, the suffocating heat of July had surrendered to a crisp, biting December wind. Inside the mahogany-paneled walls of the Ohio Federal Courthouse, the air was heavy with finality. Garrett Reynolds sat hunched at the defense table, a hollow shell of the arrogant predator who had once terrorized the streets of Oak Ridge. Stripped of his badge, his tailored uniform replaced by a faded, ill-fitting orange jumpsuit, he stared blankly at his shackled wrists. The trial had been swift and completely merciless. Chief David Harrington's internal investigation had blown the corrupt cops' operation wide open. The stolen gold watch was merely a single thread that, once pulled by federal prosecutors, unraveled a sprawling $2 million burglary syndicate orchestrated by Reynolds and a network of criminal informants. When 19-year-old Trayton Miller took the witness stand, he didn't tremble. He spoke with a quiet, unwavering iron in his voice, a profound resilience forged in the fires of that terrifying summer afternoon, and nurtured by the steady guidance of his guardian. He used his badge as a weapon to strip away my humanity. Trayton testified, his dark eyes locked firmly on the federal judge. But he failed, because true authority doesn't come from a gun, a pair of handcuffs, or a uniform. It comes from integrity. The gavel fell with a thunderous, echoing crack. 30 years in a federal penitentiary. No possibility of early parole. The city of Oak Ridge, desperate to mend its shattered public image and avoid a prolonged, highly publicized civil rights trial, settled Trayton's lawsuit for a staggering $4.5 million. But the teenager didn't buy a flashy mansion or a fleet of luxury sports cars. Guided by Commander Thomas Wright, Trayton poured the vast majority of the settlement into establishing the James Miller Legal Advocacy Fund, a non-profit named in honor of his fallen brother. The foundation was designed to provide high-powered legal representation and college scholarships to marginalized youth facing systemic prejudice and police harassment. Later that afternoon, beneath the steel-grey winter sky, Thomas and Trayton stood in comfortable silence before a pristine marble headstone at a local veterans' cemetery. The biting wind whipped at Thomas's heavy wool peacoat as the towering Navy SEAL reached into his pocket. He pulled out a heavy brass Trident challenge coin and pressed it firmly onto the cold stone above James's engraved name. "We did good by him, brother," Thomas whispered, his deep voice carrying on the wind. Trayton stood tall beside the veteran, resting a hand on Thomas's broad shoulder. The trauma of the past would always be a scar, but it was no longer an open wound. He had walked through the fire, and he had emerged victorious, fiercely protected by a warrior who had taught him that the brightest lights are often ignited in the darkest of times. Stories like Trayton's powerfully remind us that while corruption and blind prejudice still lurk in the shadows of our society, true courage and unyielding integrity will always expose them to the light. It takes immense bravery to stand up to bullies in positions of power, and it takes genuine heroes to protect the vulnerable when the system fails. If you were inspired by Commander Wright's fierce loyalty and Trayton's ultimate triumph over a corrupt cop, please hit that like button. Share this video with your community to spread this vital message, and subscribe to our channel for more incredible real-life stories of justice, redemption, and the unbreakable human spirit.